Beginning with Section 45, we are in the home stretch of our 9th module on U.S. Customs clearance procedures, with the balance of our 3 remaining sections dedicated to best practices for working with customs brokers. Policies and decisions about working with customs brokers should be made within the context of an importer's overall supply chain structure and strategy. That's just another way of saying that decisions about working with brokers shouldn't be made in a vacuum. We as importers should have a broad frame of reference about our entire supply chain and where the decisions about working or not working with customs brokers is part of a bigger picture. Some of that bigger picture, as we see in our sub-bullet, could include: how many different items do we import? Do we import 5 things or 5,000? What are our countries of origin? Do we only import from the Philippines, or do we import from 10 different countries? How many different ports of unlading do we use? These are all factors in the decision about working or not working with customs brokers. Actual decisions on vetting and selecting brokers, as well as how many brokers to work with, should also be considered strategic in nature. Here's a couple of things we need to be thinking about. At a high level, importers need to consider 3 different scenarios regarding customs clearance. First of all, should the importer operate as a self-filer, where they don't even work with a customs broker? That is a very strategic decision. Might an importer use a customs broker as a standalone service, which we will define what a standalone service is in just a moment, but essentially working with a broker just for brokerage services? Should the importer consider to integrate customs brokerage with inbound transportation services, something we've talked about in some detail? Basically using the same broker at destination in the U.S. as forwarder from origin. More on that in just a bit too. Second bullet, there are pros and cons to each model. It is up to the importer to decide the best model to use. As a note, Mercado takes a neutral stance on the importer's decision-making process. Be a self-filer, work with just a broker, or an integrated service offering. We're going to talk about each of them and present them in an objective fashion. We'll begin with operating as a self-filer, where the importer submits their own entries. They don't use a customs broker. First bullet, as noted in a previous section, customs does not mandate that an importer work with a customs broker. The importer does not have to work with a customs broker. That's a strategic decision. Second bullet, given this flexibility, the importer should decide if he or she wants to be a self-filer. And in our sub-bullet, we see that's an importer that does not use the services of a customs broker and files entries themselves to customs. As one might imagine, self-filing requires certain technological capabilities as well as regulatory/operational know-how on how to do this stuff. Let's talk about what that specifically means. First of all, to operate as a self-filer, from a technological perspective, a self-filer needs to have an ACE account as well as access to the automated broker interface. We talked about that way back when we studied ACE. Second bullet, of equal, if not greater importance, operationally, the importer needs to have a high level of in-house expertise, employees that understand the entire importation process. That starts with regulatory compliance, knowing the content of 19 CFR and how to access that content through eCFR, govinfo.gov, etc. Clearly, those in-house employees need to know the details behind classification and valuation, a topic we covered in detail, how to prepare an entry summary, that 41-field customs form, the 7501 that we went through in a lot of detail, and then post-entry administration, liquidation and protests being a good example of that. Hopefully we can see that self-filing is not uncommon, but it requires a certain level of in-house expertise. As a trade tip, ABI connectivity is available through a number of companies that offer ABI-compliant software packages. What that means is that ABI connectivity, the tools to connect with ACE, they're available commercially. The technological side of self-filing isn't all that complicated. One just has to have an ACE account as well as ABI. Let's talk about some of the advantages specific to self-filing. They include direct control over the entire entry process. We as a self-filer are not relying on third parties, a customs broker. We have direct control. Second sub-bullet, internally in our organization, we have the ability to integrate with other functional areas like sourcing, purchasing, and accounting, all parties that are very interested in the import process. Accounting being a good example from the payment of duties perspective. We have to have that integration. Third sub-bullet, as a self-filer, we can also have the ability to integrate with external service providers, working with freight forwarders, drayage companies at the port of arrival, transload operators, etc. Here's a big one, second to the last sub-bullet, the elimination of customs brokerage fees. Customs brokers aren't charities. As we will see in our final section, they charge fees, and sometimes hefty fees, for customs clearance services. As a self-filer, we don't have to deal with that. And then finally, immediate access to financial information, maybe through periodic monthly statement, where we see entered value, duties paid, merchandise processing fee, harbor maintenance fee, etc. Some possible disadvantages that we need to be cognizant of. The first one being the inability to develop the commensurate level of internal expertise needed to properly manage the end-to-end process. That's a fancy statement. It just means we don't have the in-house people with the level of expertise needed to be a self-filer. And those people can be difficult to find. Second sub-bullet, there's a fixed cost associated with managing the CHB process, which means that we have to have people on our payroll as the importer, as the self-filer, that are doing this work. And whether they do 1 entry a day or 10 entries a day, the fixed cost of employing them is going to be the same. We have to pay them a salary. We have to hopefully provide them with insurance and such. That's what we mean by fixed cost. Another factor, and this is important for self-filers that have a seasonal business where they're importing a lot during some periods of the year and not so much during others, is the ability to deal with surges and lulls in the number of entries, which could translate to, in high season, not having enough people, and in low season, to having too many people dedicated to self-filing. And then, by definition, the potential for limited access to external expertise. We don't have a customs broker we can turn to for advice, and that can be important. Let's talk about this idea of working with a customs broker, but with a standalone customs broker. The term standalone for us means that the customs broker provides custom house brokerage services only and is not part of an extended organization that engages in other areas like international transportation, drayage, transload, etc. The company we work with, the customs broker that we work with as an importer, they do brokerage, and that's it. To add some historical perspective to this story, in the second bullet, in the early days of freight forwarding and customs brokerage, it was very common for an importer to use 2 different companies, one for transportation, the forwarder, and another for customs clearance, the customs broker. Over time, service providers, 3PLs, came out with integrated services, what are now known as integrated logistics services, offering transportation and brokerage. Last bullet, as with any endeavor in life, there are pros and cons to working with a standalone broker. Let's see what those are. Advantages to working with a standalone broker. Not always, but standalone brokers tend to be boutique operations with a high level of regulatory and technical expertise. That's all these people do, is customs brokerage. So in today's day and age, they better be real good at it. That's an advantage. The broker is focused only on customs brokerage. They're not thinking about other things. Their expertise is specific to CHB. Third sub-bullet, in a boutique operation, a standalone CHB operation, brokerage files are usually handled by the same person or team. From the opening of a file until its closure, it's the same person or a limited number of people. It's not a production line where 4 or 5 people are passing one file, literally almost like a production line. It's a much more personalized approach. And of course, when we as an importer work with a customs broker, we have access to that outside expertise, to outside experts that customs actually recommends as a part of reasonable care and informed compliance. Customs does not mandate, as we've said a number of times now, that an importer has to work with a broker, but they do recognize that it provides access to outside experts when an importer does work with a broker. Some other advantages to working with a standalone broker: the fee structure, hopefully, is easy to understand. Not a lot of confusion about what the services are and the fees associated with those services. Specific to CHB activities, standalone brokers oftentimes offer value-added services, an advisory classification, tariff engineering support, things like that. Extra stuff that the broker will do, oftentimes without additional charge, that enhances their own value proposition. Third sub-bullet, standalone customs brokers tend to be proactive about updating customers on changes in regulations, laws, anti-dumping, countervailing duties, cases, etc. And finally, the depth of brokerage-related KPIs, key performance indicators, and reports. If a customs broker only offers customs brokerage, they need a complete portfolio of services, a very personalized approach in order to compete with the integrators that offer not only brokerage but other services. Some possible disadvantages to working with a broker. Number one, it represents another node in the supply chain communications network. It's another player that has to be accommodated and dealt with, and a broker relies on information coming from upstream sources. So the potential for confusion because there is an additional node is real. Second sub-bullet, a great deal of coordination is required between the broker and the origin freight forwarder because the forwarder is providing much of the documentation, certainly the transport document. If the broker is separate from the forwarder, there has to be a clear line of communication in place. A standalone broker may have a lack of national or multi-port coverage. Some standalone brokers only operate in one port. They've operated in the port of Baltimore for 40 years, and they know everything about the port of Baltimore. Importers that bring goods into other ports, that type of structure might not be so beneficial to them. Service charges have the potential to be higher because that is the only service that the standalone broker offers. They might be easy to understand, those service charges, as we mentioned in a previous slide. That doesn't mean that they're low. They could actually be higher because there's a higher level of expertise being offered too. And then sometimes these standalone brokers, they're limited technologically. Apart from having access through ABI and ACE, they're not too technologically savvy. That isn't the case all the time, but the potential exists. We're going to stop here, and when we come back, continue our conversation, this time looking at the customs clearance process through the lens of working with integrators, 3PLs that offer integrated logistics and customs brokerage services.